I've always believed that marriage is about trust, giving each other the space to breathe, to be who we are without question. So when James told me he'd be heading out tonight to watch the game with the guys, I tried to swallow the small knot of disappointment twisting in my chest. "Have fun," I said, smiling as if it didn't sting just a little. It wasn't the first time he'd mentioned a night out, and I didn't want to be the wife who hovered or doubted. Deep down, I kept telling myself that love was built on trust. Still, there was something in the air that felt different this time. After he left, I reached for my phone and called Elena. Her laughter bubbled through the line, filling the quiet spaces in my heart. "Bring a bottle," she said, her voice bright and warm. "We'll drink it all and let the world fade away." That was exactly what I needed. An evening of laughter and the kind of comfort that only old friends can give. I pulled on my favorite jeans, the ones that fit just right, and added a touch of color to my lips. Tonight was supposed to be about good wine and even better company. At least that's what I hoped for. Before I stepped out, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. There was something different in my eyes, not quite fear, but something flickering just beneath the surface. I shook my head, brushing it aside like a stray hair, and forced a smile. One last look around the quiet house, and I was out the door, keys in hand, ready to forget the unease I couldn't quite name. Or so I thought. The drive to Elena's was like a small rebellion against the tightness I felt in my chest. The night air was warm and smelled of rain, a comforting scent that reminded me of childhood summers spent on front porches, watching storms roll in. I turned up the radio, letting the music fill the car and chase away the silence that had started to feel too heavy. With each mile, I told myself I was just overthinking, that James would be exactly where he said he'd be. But there was still that gnawing feeling, a whisper in the back of my mind that I couldn't quite silence. I hated that I even had to fight these thoughts. I pulled up to Elena's house, her porch light casting a gentle glow that felt like a welcome I didn't know I needed. She was already waiting at the door, 2 glasses of red wine in hand, her grin as wide as ever. "About time," she teased, pulling me into a hug that smelled of her perfume, sweet and nostalgic. Inside, the warmth of her home wrapped around me like a familiar blanket. We settled onto the couch, the wine smooth and comforting as it slid down my throat. We talked about everything and nothing, our voices weaving together in that easy rhythm we'd perfected over years of friendship. But even as I laughed and let myself sink into the moment, a small, restless part of me couldn't let go of that flicker of doubt. It was like a thread I couldn't stop pulling, unraveling something I didn't want to see. I tried to push it away, to focus on the comfort of Elena's laughter and the soft glow of the candles. Still, every time I closed my eyes, I saw James's face, that easy smile he wore when he thought no one was watching. And even though I didn't know it yet, that was the night everything would begin to unravel. As the night wore on, I found myself staring into my glass more than at Elena. She was telling a story about her sister's new job, but my mind kept drifting, caught in the quiet spaces between her words. I nodded along, my smile fixed in place, even as my thoughts wandered to where James might be at that very moment. Was he really with the guys, caught up in the game, cheering on his team? Or was there something else in the air tonight, something he wasn't ready to share? My gut told me the answer, even if my heart didn't want to hear it. Eventually, I excused myself to the bathroom, needing a moment alone to breathe. The cold tile floor grounded me, the quiet of the small room giving me a chance to hear the racing of my own heartbeat. I took a deep breath and looked at myself in the mirror. Really looked. My face was flushed, my lips still tinted with the lipstick I'd carefully applied earlier, but my eyes, they looked haunted. I splashed some water on my face, hoping to wash away the doubt clinging to my thoughts, but it clung to me like a shadow. When I stepped back into the living room, Elena was there with a fresh glass of wine and a reassuring smile. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes searching. I forced a grin and said, "Just a little tired, that's all." But even as I said it, I felt the lie like a weight on my tongue, because in that moment I knew something had shifted, that the trust I'd wrapped myself in was starting to fray at the edges. And though I didn't know it yet, the truth was already waiting for me out there in the night. I left Elena's a little earlier than planned, claiming I was just too tired to stay up any longer. She didn't push, just pressed a kiss to my cheek and told me to drive safe. The night was still warm when I stepped outside, the air humming with the quiet songs of crickets and the soft glow of streetlights. I told myself it was silly to worry, that James was probably already home, half asleep on the couch with a beer in hand. But there was a restless energy in my chest, like a current pulling me somewhere I didn't want to go. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I turned down a side street, taking the long way home without really thinking about it. My fingers drummed the steering wheel, the music on the radio fading into the background as my mind raced. That's when I saw it. The unmistakable shape of his car parked in a driveway that wasn't ours. My breath caught, a sharp cold shock that spread through my veins like ice. For a moment, I thought maybe I was mistaken, that it was just another car that looked like his. But deep down, I knew. I always knew. I slowed the car, the headlights washing over the front of the house. My hands were shaking on the wheel as I watched the door open and saw him step out, his arm around her like it was the most natural thing in the world. They laughed, their heads tilted close in that way that made my stomach twist with something that wasn't quite anger. Not yet, anyway. And then he kissed her, right there in the soft glow of the porch light, like he didn't have a wife waiting at home. In that single, breathless moment, everything I'd been afraid to see came into sharp, undeniable focus. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, every beat echoing with a dull, aching thud. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just watched, frozen in the darkness of my car, as the world I'd trusted fell apart in front of me. The porch light flickered above them, and for a second I imagined it was a spotlight, revealing the truth I hadn't wanted to see. I felt like I was outside my own body, watching some stranger's life unravel. But this was mine. This was James. And that was all it took for the hurt to turn into something else. I wanted to scream, to slam my door shut and march right up to them, to demand answers he'd never be able to give. But instead, I stayed there, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. The air around me seemed to thicken, every breath tasting bitter and sharp. I thought of every time he'd told me he loved me, every promise he'd made, and how easily he'd tossed them aside in that moment. The betrayal felt like a knife, sharp and cold, slicing through everything I thought we were. As he pulled her closer, their laughter echoing softly through the night, I knew I had a choice to make. I could let this moment break me, or I could let it wake me up. My mind was spinning with questions I didn't want to ask, but my gut was already whispering the truth. He'd lied to me over and over again, and I'd let him because I didn't want to see it. But now, with the evidence right there in front of me, there was no way to pretend anymore. And in that split second, the shock I felt gave way to something sharper, colder, and far more dangerous. Resolve. I don't know how long I sat there, my breath fogging up the glass as I watched them disappear inside that house. A part of me wanted to keep driving, to pretend I hadn't seen any of it, but I couldn't. My fingers traced patterns on the steering wheel, my mind racing faster than my pulse. I felt numb and electric all at once, like every nerve in my body was awake and screaming. The world outside was so quiet, so normal, and yet everything had changed in an instant. My hands were shaking, but I didn't feel cold. I felt hollow. I thought about turning back to Elena's, about knocking on her door and letting the tears fall. But I didn't want pity, didn't want comfort. I wanted answers, and a plan. I took one last look at the house where my husband's lies had come to life, and then shifted the car into gear. My heart was still pounding, but there was a steadiness to my hands that hadn't been there before. The decision was made in that moment, as clear as the night sky above me. I wouldn't let him see me break. As I drove away, the glow of that porch light fading behind me, I realized that everything I'd believed about my life was nothing but a fragile illusion. But illusions can be shattered, and once they are, there's no going back. The road home was dark and winding, and my thoughts were just as tangled. But there was one thing I knew for certain. The next time I saw James, he wouldn't be the only one with secrets to keep. I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, sitting in the dark for a moment longer than I needed to. The quiet of the house seemed almost menacing, every window reflecting the secrets I carried inside. My hands were still trembling, but there was a strange calm settling in my chest, like the first breath after a storm. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and finally stepped out of the car. My footsteps on the pavement sounded loud in the darkness, but I didn't care. I was done tiptoeing around the truth. Inside, the house was exactly as I'd left it, neat, warm, filled with all the little touches that said home. But it felt different now, like a set piece in a play I no longer believed in. I walked to the kitchen, my movements deliberate, every step a silent promise to myself. I poured a glass of wine, the rich red liquid catching the soft light of the lamp like spilled secrets. I took a sip, letting the warmth spread through me, a small comfort in a night that had none. I didn't feel like crying. I felt like planning. I sat at the table, the same table where James and I had shared countless dinners and even more laughter. But tonight it was just me and the swirling thoughts in my head. I could almost hear the echo of his laughter, the way he'd reach for my hand across the plates and candles. But those memories felt far away now, like echoes in an empty house. I ran my fingers over the wood, feeling the grain beneath my fingertips, and let the quiet fill me up. Because tomorrow, everything would change, and he wouldn't even see it coming. I thought about what I'd seen, the way his hands fit around her waist, the easy smile he'd given her like it was nothing. It stung, sharper than I'd expected, but there was no room for tears now. I was done playing the role of the trusting wife who never asked questions. My mind was clear in a way it hadn't been in years, each thought slotting neatly into place like a puzzle finally complete. I didn't know exactly how I'd confront him yet, but I knew I wouldn't let him see me shatter. I refused to give him that power. I stood up and walked to the window, peering out at the quiet street, the streetlights flickering softly in the darkness. The world outside was calm, and for a moment, I let that calm wash over me. I thought about all the years I'd spent believing his promises, about the nights I'd lain awake worrying over nothing. But tonight had changed that. I wasn't the same woman who had watched him walk out the door hours ago. I was someone who'd seen the truth and was ready to act on it. I took another sip of wine, feeling it slide down my throat, warming the cold resolve that had taken root in my chest. My phone buzzed with a text. Elena checking in, making sure I was safe. I typed back a quick reply. Home, everything's fine. But that was a lie, and we both knew it, because everything wasn't fine, but it would be. I set the glass down, my fingers steady now, and waited for the sound of the door opening, knowing that when he walked in, he wouldn't find the woman he thought he left behind. I heard his car in the driveway long before he opened the door, the familiar sound of the engine cutting through the silence of the house. My heart picked up its pace, but I forced myself to stay calm, to keep that mask of indifference in place. When he stepped inside, he looked the same. Tired, casual, like a man who'd been out laughing with friends instead of breaking every promise he'd made. He didn't see the way my fingers curled around the stem of the wine glass, or the way my eyes followed every move he made. He thought he knew me. He didn't. He gave me a small smile as he set his keys on the table, the same smile he'd used 100 times to make me believe every word that spilled from his lips. Hey, he said, like nothing was different, like the world hadn't just shifted beneath our feet. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the silence stretch between us, taut and heavy, until he shifted on his feet and glanced away. In that moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes, a flash of uncertainty, maybe even guilt, and I clung to it like a lifeline. I took a slow breath, letting it fill me up with the weight of everything I knew. My voice was calm when I finally spoke, so calm it surprised even me. You must be tired, I said softly, the words laced with something he couldn't quite name. Sit down. Let's talk. I watched the way his shoulders stiffened, the way he hesitated for just a heartbeat too long. Because he didn't know what was waiting for him. Not yet. But he would. Oh, he would. He sank into the chair across from me, his eyes flicking to the glass of wine I slid across the table. I watched him carefully, my own glass steady in my hand as I leaned back in my chair. The room felt small, the silence hanging between us like a fragile thread that could snap with a single breath. He tried to smile, to play the part of the loving husband who'd just come home after a long night. But I could see it in the way his hands fidgeted, the way his gaze kept darting to the floor. He was nervous, and that was exactly what I wanted. I didn't rush him. I let him talk, let him fill the space with half-truths and practiced lies. "It was just the game," he said, his voice soft, almost casual. "The guys wanted to grab a drink, nothing special." I nodded along, my face calm, my eyes fixed on him like I was memorizing every word, because I was. I wanted to remember every syllable, every inflection of his voice as he tried to sell me a version of the night that didn't exist. And with each lie, my resolve only grew stronger. Finally, I set my glass down and leaned forward, the quiet authority in my tone catching him off guard. "Funny thing," I said, my voice as soft as a whisper but sharp enough to cut through the space between us. "I saw your car tonight, parked in front of a house that wasn't ours." His face froze, the practiced smile faltering for just a moment, and I saw the truth in the way his shoulders tensed. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my words settle over the room like a shroud. "And your lips, on someone else's." He stammered, the words catching in his throat like he was choking on the truth. "Rose, it's not what you think." His voice was thin, brittle, as if he was still trying to find a way to spin this into something harmless. But the damage was already done. I sat there, watching the man I thought I knew, the man I'd shared a life with, and I saw him for what he really was. A liar, a coward, someone who thought he could play me for a fool. My fingers drummed lightly on the table, the rhythm steady and calm, even as my heart pounded in my chest. I didn't interrupt him. I let him flounder, let the silence swallow up every excuse he tried to offer. I could see the panic in his eyes now, the way he kept glancing at the door like he wanted to run. But there was nowhere to go, no way to undo what I'd seen. "I wanted to tell you," he said finally, his voice small, like he was already shrinking under the weight of his own betrayal. I just nodded, my face expressionless. Because I didn't want his apologies. I didn't want his excuses. I wanted him to feel every ounce of the betrayal he'd handed me. "I'm not angry," I said quietly, my tone as even as the breath I took to steady it. "Not anymore." And it was true. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind something colder, sharper. I watched his face fall, the confusion in his eyes giving way to something like fear. Because he could see it now, the calm certainty in my gaze, the way my shoulders had squared. And though he didn't know it yet, the decision had already been made. I wasn't going to let this destroy me. No, I was going to use it to set myself free. I took a long sip of wine, the bitterness grounding me as I met his gaze. He looked like a man standing on a crumbling ledge, unsure whether to jump or beg for a hand to pull him back. But I wasn't going to be that hand, not tonight. I let the silence settle between us like dust, every second a reminder that the trust we once had was gone. He shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge of the table, as if he was searching for something to say that would make this all disappear. But there was nothing left to say. The weight of his betrayal pressed down on us, filling the room with an almost suffocating heaviness. And yet, in the quiet, I felt something else growing, a sense of clarity, of purpose. He tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled away, my movements slow and deliberate. "Don't," I said softly, my voice a steady anchor in the storm. He froze, his hand falling back to the table as his shoulders slumped in defeat. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But pity wasn't something I had left to give. I stood up slowly, pushing back my chair as I took one last look at him. The man I'd loved, the man I'd trusted. In that moment, he looked so small, so insignificant compared to the truth I held in my hands. "I hope the game was worth it," I said, my voice calm and even. And with that, I turned and walked away, my steps quiet but certain, leaving behind the echoes of everything he thought he could keep hidden. because the real game was about to begin, and this time the rules were mine to write. The next morning, I woke up with a calmness that felt almost foreign. The sun streamed in through the curtains, painting the room in warm light that had nothing to do with the cold determination in my heart. I moved through the house deliberately, every step a quiet promise to myself that I wouldn't let him have the last word. There was no more room for doubt or second-guessing, not after what I'd seen. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the rich, bitter scent grounding me in this new reality. Because today was the day I'd take back everything he thought he'd stolen from me. I gathered the documents I'd been careful to set aside. Account numbers, passwords, everything I needed to make sure I was protected. I'd always handled our finances with care, but today, I handled them with precision. The lawyer's number was already in my phone, my thumb hovering over it like a secret weapon. I took a deep breath and pressed call, my voice steady as I explained exactly what I needed. There was no tremor in my words, no hint of the heartbreak that had tried to swallow me whole. Only clarity, only resolve. When the call ended, I felt lighter, like a weight I'd carried for years had finally been lifted. I took a sip of my coffee, letting the warmth soothe the last traces of the fear that had haunted me the night before. I didn't know exactly what the future would look like, but I knew it wouldn't include him. And that thought, that freedom, tasted sweeter than any promise he'd ever made. I smiled to myself, feeling the steel in my spine, and set about the final steps of my plan, a plan that he'd never see coming. I spent the morning making sure every detail was in place. The accounts were secure, the paperwork filed, all legal, all precise. Each signature felt like a final word in a conversation that was long overdue. I took my time, double-checking everything, letting the quiet click of the keyboard and the soft shuffle of paper be the soundtrack to my liberation. There was a power in these small, deliberate actions, the kind of power he had never imagined I'd hold. And it wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about taking back the control he thought he could keep from me. When I was done, I gathered the photos I'd taken, the final proof of the life he'd tried to build behind my back. They were just images, but they carried the weight of every lie he'd told me, every whispered excuse that no longer had a place in my heart. I sent them to my lawyer with a calm, simple message. This is all I need you to see. My hands didn't tremble. My heart didn't race. I'd already lived through the worst of it. Now I was just closing the door on what was never really mine. I looked around the house, the quiet spaces that used to feel so full of us, our laughter, our arguments, our dreams. But now, they were just rooms waiting for a new story. I thought about how he'd come home tonight, how he'd find nothing left of the woman who once believed his every word. I wondered if he'd even understand what he'd lost. But it didn't matter anymore. Because as I gathered my things and stepped out into the light of a new day, I knew the real victory wasn't in hurting him. It was in freeing myself. I drove to Elena's with the windows down, the warm air washing over me like a quiet promise that life was waiting just beyond the horizon. When I pulled into her driveway, she was already there on the porch, her eyes soft with understanding. She didn't ask any questions. She didn't need to. She just pulled me into a hug, the kind that felt like coming home to myself. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself breathe without the weight of his lies pressing down on my chest. We opened a bottle of wine, the cork popping with a satisfying finality that made us both laugh. As we sat on her porch watching the sun dip below the trees, I felt the smallest smile curve my lips. It wasn't the bitter kind I'd worn the night before. It was real, warm and honest, a reflection of the woman I was finally becoming. Elena raised her glass to me, her eyes bright. "To new beginnings," she said, and I echoed the words back, letting them settle in my bones like a promise I was ready to keep. He thought I'd break. He thought I'd crumble under the weight of his betrayal, but he didn't understand the woman he'd been living with all these years. Because I wasn't just surviving. I was rebuilding. And as the last light of the day slipped below the horizon, I felt something shift inside me. Something strong and sure and unbreakable. He thought he could keep me in the shadows of his lies. Instead, I stepped out into the light. And this time, I wasn't going back.